Hey everyone, it's Shawn McBride here for another edition of Best in Events. If you've been following us on YouTube, Deirdra Watson, who will be joining me in just a minute, and I have been interviewing a lot of people in the events and conference industry, and we're looking for what's going on, and we're also looking for lessons of what's in the future. So we thought today we would just sit down with you, talk live here. If you're watching live, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and we'll sit down with you and we'll talk about what we're seeing in events right now and also what might be coming in the future. So I'm going to invite Deirdra to pop up here and join me. Hey, Deirdra.
Hi there. Hold on a
Good to see you.
Yeah, I can hear
And
you.
so, okay, perfect. Good to see you. So we've been interviewing a lot of people. We've done a number of shows on the events, and I think we're starting to see some trends. Right, we're starting to see some real things coming up over and over again. So you want to open by just kind of talking about what we're seeing right now, Deirdra?
Yeah, well, as we all know, one of the biggest things that we are seeing is virtual events. A lot of companies have moved to virtual events. They've had to pivot very quickly to virtual events, and now we're seeing that there potentially could be the hybrid event where it's a virtual as well as in person. And so it's really opened up a lot of discussions within a multitude of suppliers and vendors in regards to how do we pivot, how do we make this time uh, workable for our clients, as well as looking at the future on what the event industry is going to look like.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge piece of it, right? Is a lot of people have been forced to test virtual. We've had some people just say, okay, we're going to cancel for 2020. We'll try again in 2021. Some are trying to go to the fall, but I think the problem we're now having with the fall is there's just a cloud of uncertainty hanging over top of it, right? So if somebody's trying to squeeze an event in 2020, there's just a lot of uncertainty about whether people are going to travel or not. I was just talking to an event organizer here. I think they've got an event in September, and they're on the fence. They're like, we got to make a decision soon because we're only 3 months away, and we just don't know what's going to happen with the situation, right? We don't know where the virus is going to be and what's going to be happening. So it makes it very difficult to plan.
Yeah, it definitely does. And news was released today that, and I'm not going to name any brands here, but news that was just released today that one of the largest hotel owners and brands was not going to open the majority of their properties until October.
Yeah.
Which means that there's tens and thousands of people that are still going to be furloughed. And that means any of their properties that had rescheduled to September could potentially not have their events in September.
Yeah, I think that's a real open issue. And the other thing I saw was airlines. Similarly, there was an article came out, and and here in the U.S., the airlines were bailed out, and part of the bailout package is they've got to keep their employees through the end of September. And this article was saying basically a lot of them are planning on mass layoffs in early October because they don't expect demand to be back. And that's going to be a real issue because if you're trying to hold an event, even if you can secure the space, you got to get the people there. And if there's less flights, it's going to be much harder scheduling wise.
Right. And one of the things that we have seen in our discussions or heard in our discussions from those that we have interviewed is that events are going to turn regional. And I've talked to so many people in the industry about that they will become regional, that you're going to have 250 to 300 max. And that's mostly based on availability of inventory. Plus, you're going to be looking at all the new seating arrangements that are being looked at. For example, if you've got a classroom style, you're going to have, everybody's going to have their 3 to 6 feet between them. Yes. So in order to be in a classroom situation, so where you have maybe a 12 or 15 foot table or 18-foot table, depending on how long your tables are, so 16 feet with 2 8-foot tables, you're only going to be able to have 3 people at those tables.
Yeah. And that's
so it really is going to change a lot of the dynamics in regards to your seating. There may be a lot more classroom. Remember when we were in grade school where we had our desks that had the side arms? There may be a lot more of those brought in just exclusively for conferences. So you may be looking at an additional cost of single seating, especially when you've got an auditorium, like a big ballroom where you want to have 250 people. You've got to have that 6 feet around everyone.
Yeah, and of course, one of my favorite part of events is going out and doing the networking part, right? You go through the conference all day, you learn a bunch of new information, you meet a few new people in the hallway, but then you get out and get to have a drink and mingle with everybody. And, I've heard a lot of different theories on what's going to happen there, but it doesn't seem like that's going to be as easy to pull off as it was in the past.
No, it probably won't. And one of the things that was brought up was networking through plexiglass dividers. I don't know if that's really going to work because people want to have that face-to-face contact. So do you have a larger space where people can say, okay, 6 feet away, but what if you want to have a more confidential or intimate conversation with someone? You're not going to be standing 6 feet away from them to speak. So they may have to have separate rooms for separate confidential conversations. And I've done that with my smaller events that I focused on. Is we would have a confidential room where you could actually go and book a time, usually slotted out in 1 hour intervals, that you could go and talk to someone on a confidential basis. Maybe you wanted to talk to a client or wanted to talk to an employee or whatever. So you were able to schedule at that time. That you may see a couple of rooms like that where people can actually go and have those more intimate conversations.
Yeah, if you're watching live, drop some comments, or if you're watching a recording, let us know what you think about kind of separating out and kind of being in a non-traditional happy hour or networking event. And, one thing was the plexiglass. I mean, we talked about first, it feels a lot like prison, right? Like you're going to walk
exactly
the side of a prison wall. But the other piece of that, too, is that it raises another sanitary issue, which is if you have these booths or whatever with the plexiglass divider, after one person leaves, then somehow this thing has to be sanitized. And I think that's been a recurring theme we've heard about, too. There's a lot of thought about cleaning and how do you do cleaning in a practical way.
Well, and studies have indicated that this particular virus can live up to 5 days on surfaces, which why there's a huge, I guess, a huge push by many of the vendors and the venues on what is the best way to clean surfaces to make sure that the virus isn't hanging around. Like, we don't even know if your basic, let's say, Lysol works on cleaning this virus off of surfaces. There was just, I think Hong Kong just had a huge conference, and they were doing everyone's temperature as they came in.
Right. And we'll see more of that probably.
Right. And then also what they did is that they did have the arrows going down the aisles. For trade shows, what's probably going to happen is, because I think it was 8 feet before it's the norm or fire code access between each row. Now you're probably going to see 10 to 12 feet between each row, where you have that 6 feet going each way. And then you will only be able to go one way. You won't be able to cross over. So that in itself for exhibitors could be very difficult when someone is across from them. Okay, well, I got to go all the way up and down. It's like going to the grocery store right now.
Right. Well, a lot of people think about getting that foot traffic, and a lot of the vendors, they try to set up in a way where they have their booths set up so when people are passing down the hallway, they get into a conversation with them. Well, that's not going to be as practical with wider spaces and then not the same foot traffic it's going to be much harder to just kind of get that informal conversation when somebody pauses to check their phone or whatever. It's going to be a completely different experience for the vendors.
It really will, and especially in also in regards to when you are at a trade show, what is the food court going to look like,
Yep.
and how is that going to be managed? So this is really going to change events.
Yep.
It won't stop events, but we're
Yep.
all, as planners, we're all going to have to do some extra thinking and strategic planning
Yep.
around our events and how we're putting them together, and
Yep.
sharing information is key during this whole time.
Right.
And what are what are you doing virtually? What are you doing to look at the future? I know that some for example, Live Nation came out with a report that basically said this year, like many other businesses, is going to be a write-off because
Yep.
they're not doing like they had until February, March for their concerts, but
Yep.
they're not even going to be looking until like Q2 of next year to even start looking at bringing in conferences or a
Yep.
conference, right?
Yep.
So overall, live events, conferences, it's a $1 trillion business,
Yes.
and worldwide, and it's been completely shut down to
Yep.
a degree, especially now that we're starting to do, or we are
Right.
doing virtual.
And it's going to be radically transformed. And here we've got a live question from one of our viewers. So again, folks, we encourage you, drop your questions if you're watching live. If you're watching on replay, feel free to leave the questions. We'll either comment back to you or we'll include a future episode. We try to respond to you here at the Best in Events channel because we want to make sure we get you the information you need. So Natalie Wong has asked us, who's mandating these ideas and who's enforcing these rules. And I kind of have a little bit of a take, I came into this world as a lawyer, right? So, how I ended up in the event space is I'm a practicing lawyer and then got into doing some public speaking around business strategy. And that then brought me into the events world. And I can tell you it's going to be a couple different ways. So, who's mandating these? You've got a lot of local governments, and it's a real issue here in the U.S. because, you don't just have one, you have many, right? So you may have a state that's saying this, a state that's saying that. We got 50 states. And all of them are opening on different schedules. And then you have counties and cities, and all of them have regulations. And I think what we'll see is a lot like fire codes. They'll be saying, you have to have a certain distance between people at your event, right? They may send somebody in there, a government person, to check. They've been doing that on a spot basis throughout the U.S. So I think you're going to have that side of it. You're also going to have the legal liability side, which is, one of the ways things happen in the U.S. is safety standards. So I could see the potential of somebody who gets sick at a conference turning around and suing the conference, saying, hey, you weren't sufficiently safe in your procedures. You didn't clean enough. So we're going to have the actual government regulations, and then we're going to kind of have the safety standards emerge through litigation where they're going to say, this is what a reasonable behavior is. This is the type of cleanliness you should have. So we're going to have really two sets of standards here. What do you think, Deirdra?
Well, I really think that, and we have the same situation here in Canada, is that we've got, certain businesses have been able to open, and and nobody's really mandated. It's not, the health board, it's not the governments. It's the hotels working with their groups to make sure that they follow some precedent. CDC and the WHO have brought out these, let's say, suggestions on these precautions, and I think one of the biggest things that I'm implementing with my business is that we are going to have a certain procedures in regards to our events to make sure that we're working with the venues on what are their policies and procedures for cleanliness, for sanitation. And I recommend that, you have someone on staff that can go in and do a pre-check on the sanitation, that works with the event planner, that works with the vendor, and make sure that, those procedures are in place, and that companies that do conferences have, we all when we work with corporate companies, they have a health and safety committee.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So
And then
working with health and safety to make sure that the employees are taken care of, and also indicating proper signage throughout your event that you have done the utmost
yep.
to provide a safe and clean area for your attendees.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be something we're going to see, right? So the people that are, the meeting planners, the people that are hosting the events, are going to have to get up to speed on some of the sanitation stuff. And we did a segment here on the Best in Events channel. You can search it on YouTube, where we talked to Christy Redfern about kind of some of the safety standards and what might be out there. But I think if you're hosting an event, you're going to have to understand it. We had another one of our guests that was speculating that the conference centers and the hotels may be open to sharing their sanitation checklists or how they do the procedures. But I think as a matter of good care, an event planner may want to go in and ask to see the procedures and double check them and make sure that they're reasonable in light of what's happening at the conference. So I think this is going to just add another layer of complexity and another cost, right? One thing that we've seen universally is more cost. But I think you're going to have to go in and understand what's happening. I mean, Deirdre, I think this is something you were doing way back in the past.
Oh yeah, whenever I would do a site check, I would, basically have a tour of all the accommodation rooms. How clean are they? Look between the cracks.
Mm-hmm.
And especially also, what do the kitchens look like? What are the restrooms that are closest to the conference? Who's coming in before the conference? Who's going to be there during the conference? If it's a multiple conference venue, who's going to be there at the same time? And I always asked that because I didn't want to be competing, of course, with someone that was similar to a client that I had. I think that what is going to happen is that with venues that are of multiple usage, where you can have a number of conferences going on at the same time, we're going to kind of see that slow down, because you don't want to have that cross contamination, if you want to call it, of different people coming in from different areas. And you want to be able to say, I want run of house regarding my conference. I don't want anyone else here at the same time. And also, I think what may happen with a lot of venues is the 3 to 5 days, there won't be that quick turnaround for conferences that were in the past, where, one night you've got one conference going out and the next morning you've got another conference coming in, because they'll have to do a larger scale sanitation between the different conferences that are coming in.
Yeah, I think that's some important points. I think you need to understand the sanitation in between. You need to understand sanitation during the event. And then, like you mentioned, if there's other conferences there, either you need to get run of the house, or you need to understand how you're going to separate people, right? Because, I mean, there's just so many opportunities in a hotel, right? You're sharing elevators, sharing hallways. I've seen a lot of venues where, there's a common hallway. There might be a bunch of different conference rooms, and you have people from one conference passing by another conference.
That's right.
And it hasn't been a big deal in the past, other than just the logistical side of making sure everybody's roped off and in the right section. But now you're starting to talk about some, medical risk with it, and that's going to change the thinking on that.
Yeah, and you brought up the point about elevators. So before, you might be able to fit 12 plus people in an elevator. Now, based on the size of the elevator, you may only be able to have 4 to 6 people in that elevator. And you may have to wait for another elevator, and then on top of that, you've got the buttons to push. So what are they going to be doing in regards to the sanitation of buttons? Like, you can't remember back in the old days, they used to have an elevator operator. Well, they may end up having to do that now, just for the interim for the next few years, to bring in someone that sits in the elevator and presses the button, because you've got that sanitation.
There's a store here in Florida. They actually have an employee assigned to the front door, and they're wiping the front door down, the handles, like every time somebody comes in or out, right? I mean, most places aren't going to that level, but they've gone to the level of saying, we're just going to assign an employee to our front door, and as people go in and out, they're cleaning the door.
Well, maybe we'll go back to, I know some of the bigger stores like Hudson's Bay here in Canada, their big flagship store in Toronto, they'd have a doorman.
Yes.
And the doorman would open the door, like some of the bigger hotels. So you might find that that's going to happen with some of these. Well, in these venues do have doormen,
Mhm.
but overall, you might find that they're going to have elevator operators. So that's going to add to their bottom line
Yeah.
on having to hire more employees, that somebody just sits there all day and presses the elevator button, so that people have that not fear of pressing a button.
I think that's an important thing that we keep seeing here, right? Is, regardless of what is we're talking about with safety procedures, it's, less utilization of space and more labor. So,
Yeah,
we're talking about spreading people out in the conference room. I've heard about some hotels, spacing people's guest rooms out or leaving a guest room dormant for a day or two between guests, right? I mean,
that's
there's
right.
all different ways that this could happen. Cleaning in between people, having the door cleaned, having the doorman always there, because sometimes the doorman goes off to help somebody, the valet or whatever. There's certain times where you go to a hotel, even a nice hotel, and the doorman not necessarily is there, right? They might be off attending to somebody else or whatever. This is all pointing to more cost, more labor, more cost,
That's
more
right.
cleaning, more. So that's going to really, that's got to flow through to the conference at some event, at some point.
Oh, and it certainly will, and that's going to change your contracts.
Yeah.
And when you're looking at sanitation, you should have a clause in the contract for sanitation. And even what the schedule of that will look like, because of course, if you've got a 3-day conference, you've got cleanup in the evening. So what will that cleanup look like?
Mm-hmm.
How will they be turning around your room, like your conference space? Are they going to turn it around every night to put clean linens on? Are you going to just say to people, okay, you've got to sit in this space for the whole 3 days that you're there?
Right.
Give everybody a name tag for their desk, and that's where you go back tomorrow, kind of
Yeah.
thing. So there's going to be a lot in regards to the contracts, and again, also too, what will the force majeure look like now because of the pandemic? Because it was one thing that really wasn't in there before, was a pandemic. So
nobody contemplated something of this scale, hitting this way, and we've talked about that. And so, yes, it wasn't fully negotiated. Now there has to be a real conversation about the financial risk, right? Does the hotel take the risk? Does the conference take the risk? Do you somehow allocate the risk? That's got to be a real conversation that's had. What if this virus picks up again, or what if there's some future virus? Everybody needs to know how they're going to handle it.
well, and I was just going to mention that because the potential for us to go into a second wave
Mm-hmm.
is extremely strong.
Yes.
Here in Ontario, there's been a rise in numbers, and it was just after Mother's Day. So what they're thinking is that people got together for Mother's Day and whatnot, so that there's a growth of numbers. I haven't looked at the numbers in the past few days, whether or not they're going down, but we are potentially, the risk is high for us to go into a second wave, and that second wave would probably occur August, September, October.
Exactly. And so we've got that coming. Who knows if there's another virus out there, that comes after this. Right now, that kind of everybody's sensitive to it, and who knows what's happening, right? So we got to kind of plan for the fact of the potential disruption. It's a very real possibility. And so we've got to build that into our contracts and our thinking.
Yeah, and working with your clients on making sure that their contracts are up to par. I review contracts with a fine tooth comb, and make sure that my client gets the best value for their dollar.
Yeah.
And now you've got to look at it even further in regards to, as I said, sanitation, room placement, room setups.
Yeah.
And working with the venue on having those conversations before you book, when you're doing your site searches, working with site selection companies on that. Like, here's the specifics. If you've got a 250 person group, 12,000 square meters of space might not be big enough anymore.
Yeah. Yep. And let's zoom into a little bit on the virtual events. So, everybody's been forced to virtual events largely as a backup option. I think all of us understand that, we all see the benefits and the desire to do in person, but there's a lot of talk about hybrid events coming forward. I can see probably some of the lower budget events are going to have a hard time with these costs. So they're going to have to probably go more virtual. And I think the other conferences, if you are planning a conference and you have to go forward, you got to at least have virtual planned as a backup now, right? So you got to kind of plan a dual track, right? Like we're going to plan to have the event here. We think we can have it. But if there's another breakout of the pandemic, we got to fall back to virtual. So virtual meeting is becoming a much bigger planning concern for everybody in the industry.
Yeah, it is. And think that as a planner, and I've done a couple of virtual events in the past,
Yes.
and webinars, and actually working with other clients on user groups and things like that, where we would have to pull in a keynote virtually. And the biggest thing I can recommend to event planners is work with a company that has a good track record on doing virtual events. There's so many companies out there that have popped up. Mm-hmm. I can do your event. I can do your virtual event. I can do your virtual event. And the problem is that they might not have the expertise.
Yes.
And the biggest thing is you want to make your client, whether it be the CEO, general manager, or whoever you report to, or even your boss, you want to make them look great. If you use a virtual event company that doesn't have a great track record or a lot of experience, then you're the one that is going to suffer in the long run, because it's not going to make the manager or CEO look good.
Yes, right. I agree. And so, you're going to have to think about that. Chris Gerhardt did a wonderful segment with us here on the show, and he was actually using some of this technology, right? He was
which was very cool.
Yeah, it's very cool. So you can go check that out again on the Best in Events YouTube channel. We got a couple of user comments here, so let me pop them up here. And again, feel free to bring your comments and questions. We love them. If you're catching it on the recording, feel free to put those down there too, because we either comment back to you or we'll pick it up in a future segment here. Abby's saying it's going to be hard to get these clauses in the contracts. I think that's talking about the idea of, getting these kind of cleanliness clauses in there and the force majeure clauses. And what do you think? I have my guess on it, Deirdra, but I'll let you go first.
I think the hotels and venues are totally aware of the situation. And, they've probably all gone to their legal departments to discuss what's this going to look like moving forward.
Yeah.
And, contracts aren't made to be broken, but they have been broken. But I really think that if you ask for a certain clause to be in it, and they need to take it to their legal will word it in a way that indemnifies them.
Yes.
But it's going to put your client at ease if they see it in a contract.
Well, I think there's just going to be a need to have these conversations, right? So, it's a real business deal. I think part of it's going to be timing, right? So we're envisioning a world where we're going to have more spacing between people at conferences. That means we're going to be using up more space. But the conference, the venues are excited to get people back. So I think
that's right.
If you get in early, you may have some negotiating leverage. And, we've heard some people say they think that the hotels are going to be open to these conversations because they want to get people back. They need to reboot their business.
Right.
If you get a little bit farther down the line and everybody starts getting comfortable and then the venues start getting over full, and we've heard, one of our guests talked in one of our episodes about the idea that, they just couldn't keep, they're already having trouble getting stuff booked into 21, 22, 23 for big events.
Exactly.
So at some point the demand's going to shift, right? There's not going to be enough conference space with everybody spaced out potentially for all the events. Then it may be harder to get these clauses in there. So I think if you act early, you may be able to get these clauses in.
Yeah, and the goal of the venues is to get groups there.
Mm-hmm.
Groups, contribute to a large amount of revenue to venues, to hotels, to resorts, and that's the goal. Get people out again, but keeping people safe is important. And in all my contracts, I am going to I change them so that I do have a safety and sanitation clause in my contracts. Of course, I'm going to have that point of indemnity in there as well.
Yeah, and I think,
because there's certain things that we all know that we don't have control over.
Right.
And so we have to be very careful about what we put out there.
Yeah, and another theory too we've heard is, particularly on the sanitation clauses, the hotels actually want to get in front of it. They want to say, hey,
exactly,
we're clean, come back. So again, it points to timing. The sooner you get your conference scheduled, and I think if you're planning a conference, say September, October, you may have a lot of negotiating leverage right now because there's not a lot of demand. So you may be able to get concessions. You might be able to get, a clause with a better force majeure clause, understanding there may be a second wave, because the conference is going to be of the mind, hey, I'd rather put people in the rooms and have a chance of getting people here. And if they cancel, I wasn't going to be able to rent the space anyway. So it really depends on your situation.
Yeah, no, and those conferences that were, canceled in March and maybe moved to June are now taking place in the fall, right?
Yeah.
And so there might not be a lot of inventory, especially if the larger hotels are not opening.
Yes.
As we all expect, because they're still trying to figure out what their procedures are going to look like. Shawn, can we go back to some of the comments in regards to the virtual? The virtual meetings.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of comments about the virtual events.
Yeah, and I think it's a discussion to have.
Our live audience here is talking about the virtual events. I definitely think so. I don't know if we want to pop their particular names up here on screen just in case.
No, we can we can mention some of them are. That's right. Yeah.
Which is, we have a number of people commenting that these virtual event companies remind them of ambulance chasers, or they're popping up out of the woodwork. I mean, I think there is a market need, right? People do need virtual events. The problem is it's highly unregulated, and I think you need to ask people what their experience is, right? Have you done this before? Have you done it successfully? How are you coming into this? If you were doing virtual events before, like Chris was, and he said, hey, I'm just doubling down on this, I'm doing more of it, that makes more sense to me as a buyer than somebody who just said, well, I read a book about it one time, or I went online and Googled it.
Exactly. And, my recommendation is, as I said, go with a company that's got a good track record. Ask around. We're all about sharing. And, if you're part of any groups on Facebook or LinkedIn, ask them who they've used, because that's your referral right there. And make sure that you look at their website and have a really good look at their website in regards to, do they post who they've worked with in the past. A good virtual event company will have been around for a number of years if they've transitioned from doing events to a virtual event, because virtual events just didn't start yesterday.
No, they're not brand new. It's just there's more demand for them, right? So I get what some people say, which is we're now doing, virtual event companies obviously are doing more virtual events, and there's some companies that attract, they change their allocation. That's just natural, right? More virtual events, you need more virtual event services, but there's some that haven't really done it. They just popped up out of nowhere.
Yeah, and be cautious, because again, it's your client, it's your manager that you want to make look good. And the thing with virtual events is that because you're doing a virtual event, you don't have the cost of accommodations or room.
Mm-hmm.
And with virtual events, there's some companies that actually have a virtual, like you can have a studio to go to.
Deirdra, I think you're.
I'm here.
You cut out. You cut out
Okay.
for a second.
Okay.
It just packaged it together. Go ahead. I think you're good again.
And so with virtual event companies, look at one that's going to meet your needs. Look at one that's going to meet the needs of do you want an MC? Well, some virtual event companies offer an MC. They'll offer a virtual background. So you could actually have your corporate logo in the background. They offer rooms. Look at the different platforms that a virtual event company is using. Zoom is not the only company out there.
Absolutely.
And
Zoom's a good platform for a small meeting, but if you're really trying to do something large and on a high scale, you probably want to move to some other application.
Right, especially if you want to have breakout rooms and everything else. So it's really what's going to work best for you. And the virtual company doesn't have to be like, for example, in the United States, there's companies all over the world, but you also want to make sure that you're at the mercy of your internet bandwidth when you're dealing with virtual as well. So you want to make sure that your bandwidth is secure, for one, secure, and that they have a strong enough bandwidth to bring in the virtual components, such as your speakers, such as the amount of people that you're going to have at your event.
Yes. It just brings another layer of planning. A good company hopefully has been through this, and they've got the checklist. They've got the bandwidth. They also have the prep sheets for the speakers and all your guests to make sure that everybody's got their internet connection working right. I mean, there's a whole nother layer of issues that are new when you go to a virtual event.
Exactly, because normally when I've done conferences in the past and I've got a keynote speaker, and what I do is I make sure that he's hardwired to the internet. Well, now you can't guarantee that someone's going to be hardwired, especially if you've got a keynote speaker. He's in his office at his home base. What is he using? So he may be just on his Wi-Fi. So, Wi-Fi is not necessarily as stable, but then again, your internet might not necessarily be stable. So it's always a good idea to do tech check. And a tech run before, so at least either the day before or an hour before, make sure everybody is knowledgeable, and you go through as a planner, you go through with your speaker, what is the process going to be. Make sure that you outline in a document what's going to happen, how are the links going to be. Make sure that their computer is up and running and ready to go. And that their browser, if they're using a browser, or their Zoom or whatever program they're working, is running the way it's supposed to. Because again, Murphy's Law, anything that can happen will.
Absolutely. You're gonna have a lot of issues, secondary internet connections too. I've seen that on a checklist recently where, okay, you got to have your primary internet at your house, but can you go to your cell phone or some other way to get on the internet, should that break up, right? I mean,
exactly.
Do that because, it's very possible that your keynote is, somebody cuts the wire out front of their house, or the local cable company has a problem, and they got to have a secondary way to get on so that you can keep your schedule.
Yeah, and the other thing with virtual events is lighting. Make sure that you have good lighting when you're doing a virtual event. You don't want to have a dark face.
Right.
And there's a whole bunch of ton of stuff on YouTube and whatnot about proper lighting. I do enough of these that I actually went out and bought, a light that I could do the Zooms with, and I'm not using as much natural light, but I'm lit.
Light is key. Also, day-night, that raises the issue of day-night, right? So when you test with your speaker, make sure you test day and night, right? I mean, can you if don't have a situation where you have a speaker is going to be on tomorrow morning and you test the lighting at night, and then you make it a surprise because it's the windows or other things.
Yeah, and try not. And the other thing with virtual is try not to use above lighting, because that gives too many shadows. So you want direct lighting in front of your face, so that you have a more natural look.
Yep.
And but again, I can't stress about your internet connection and using the right company for your virtual event.
Folks, it's been a wonderful session, Deirdre. Thanks for the conversation.
Yeah,
We're
thanks.
summarizing what we've been talking about on the Best in Events YouTube channel. We'll be doing more recordings, so make sure you're subscribed, ring the bell for notifications, and we of course appreciate those of you who've been joining us live here and putting your comments in. If you're on a recording, we want your comments as well. Let us know where you're watching from, what questions you have, what we can get into future episodes. Just drop them on this video over at the Future Done Right channel, and then subscribe and make sure you're getting the notifications. And then, of course, let us know. We're generally recording at 2 p.m. Eastern on various days, depending on guests. So if you're subscribed, you'll get notifications when we go live so that you can join in the fun. So 2 p.m. Eastern, mark your calendar, many days each week. For 2 or 3 days a week, we're usually going live, depending on guest schedule. So look forward to seeing you there, folks.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.